I'm Shorter Than Average Girl from Down Under, and today we're going back to Narnia, 1,288 years after the Pevensies reached England. In the Return to Narnia, The Rescue of Prince Caspian, more commonly known as Prince Caspian. Unlike The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there are a few plot differences between the story and the movie. Predominantly that the film is a lot more mature and it adds things that don't exist in the book. And the book is a bit more speciest. But again, just as I highlighted in the first video, which will be up there right now, I think that the differences in the two have an additive effect, which enrich the story at the end. The events at the start of the movie actually occur way into the book, almost about halfway. So today we'll be covering both of them, starting off with the events in the book and then tagging on the events in the movies as we get to them. And through this story, we will discuss the different types of faith through the lenses of different characters. But if you're only here for the movie review, please click on the time shown on the screen right now or the timestamp in the description, whichever suits you best. But for now, let's talk stories. Caspian is the fourth book chronologically in the Narnia series, and takes place about an Earth year after the events of the previous film. The novel starts off with the Pevensies saying goodbye to Professor Kirk, and then him dumping the bombshell that he's actually been to Narnia before, just before their mum makes it to the front door to pick them up. Nice play there, Professor. That is definitely a way to get the kids to come back and visit you again. Anyhow, back in London, the Pevensies now have to go to boarding school, with Peter and Edmund going to an all-boys school and Susan and Lucy going to an all-girls one. But we'll get back to the Pevensies later. Now, in Narnia, after the kings and queens went missing, the Narnians had no idea what to do. I mean, they spent a few months looking for them, but that didn't work out. Then kings and queens from neighboring kingdoms started to come and take over, but that was never stable because those kingdoms are fighting amongst themselves anyways. So the Narnians formed their own council to try and maintain some kind of order in the land and preserve the tales of old. And it's this council which ends up building Aslan's How, the tomb where the stone table is. But unfortunately, that wasn't enough to keep the Narnians from turning back into non-talking beasts. So when Talmar, all the way in the west, was facing a famine and political unrest, Caspian I decided to lead this semi-military occupation of Narnia, which was basically a conquest, so much so that they believed that Narnians had gone extinct. And then generations down the line, Caspian X is born, who is the protagonist of our story. So what makes Caspian X so special? First, his nurse used to tell him stories of old Narnia to make him fall asleep, so he was exposed to the truth very early on in his life. His father is out of his life in his childhood because, spoiler alert, his uncle ends him. So he's basically raised by his professor, Professor Cornelius, who is part Narnian. When the Telmaranian invasion took place, some of the dwarfs decided to shave off their beards and live amongst the Telmaranes as humans, and so they ended up mingling with them, and these half-breeds of half-dwarfs, half-human were born, which is what Professor Cornelius is. His professor taught him everything from history, grammar, astronomy, horse riding, archery, sword fighting, etc., etc., etc. When Caspian's mother passes away, his uncle Miraz becomes Lord Protector, playing king until Caspian is of age. One night, Professor Cornelius wakes Caspian up for an astronomy lesson. They see a rare astronomical event. The planet of victory, Tava, and the planet of peace, Amavale, will pass each other in the high heavens. For the Narnians, this represented the start of a revolution, the start of the time when Narnians come back. And so the professor uses this as an opportunity to tell Caspian the truth about his identity, about Narnia, and pleads to him to be a good king. But then Miraz's wife, Pruna Primzia, gives birth to a son. So now Miraz ain't planning on giving the throne to his nephew Caspian. He wants his flesh and bone on the throne, which means Caspian's gotta go. That night, with the help of the professor, Caspian runs away into the forest to survive Miraz's plan. The professor gives Caspian Queen Susan's horn and tells him to head into the woods because he knew that the Telmarines won't follow him into. See, the Telmarine rulers have been lying to their subjects, telling them that ghosts live in the woods, and they did that so that none of them would venture too far to the east and reach Aslan's country, because they were scared of Aslan turning their people against them. As Caspian was running away, this huge storm comes and he gets knocked off his horse by a tree branch, right in front of the den of Truffle Hunter the Badger, Nickabrick the black-bearded dwarf, and Trumpkin the red-bearded dwarf. Initially, the dwarfs planned on killing Caspian, but Truffle Hunter stopped them and tended to Caspian as he saw Susan's horn on him. When Caspian wakes up and finds out that Narnians actually still exist, he is in awe. I mean, it's like your childhood dreams all coming true in front of your eyes. And when Caspian tells them his true identity, well, there are mixed reactions. Truffle Hunter pledges his allegiance to him, as he remembers
Narnia was never right, except when a son of Adam was king.
And so, given Caspian's enthusiasm and kindness towards the Narnians, then he may have been sent here to save them. Nickabrick did not agree. A Tolmarine is a Tolmarine, and so can never be trusted. He didn't believe in the kings and queens of old, he didn't believe in Susan's horn, and he didn't believe in Aslan. Now, as for Trumpkin, well, he believes in parts, but not in others. Like, he believed back in the day Aslan used to help, but not anymore. He believed that Narnia needed kings and queens, which were the sons of Adam or daughters of Eve, but not a Tolmarine. And he didn't believe in Susan Horn. But unlike Nickabrick, he was willing to give Caspian a chance. And so, given that the three of them couldn't come to a conclusion, they thought it was only fair that all the Narnians come together and make the decision. Democracy. So they call the squirrel Pattertwig to go and invite all the Narnians to their first election in 1,288 years. But despite that, the dwarves decide that they want a second opinion from their own people, 'cause dwarfs be special in that way. But
It is not this day.
Where we talk about the dwarf trope.
I'm listening. On behalf
First, they visit the 7 brothers of Shuddering Woods, red dwarfs like Trumpkin, who work as blacksmiths along the northern slopes. At first, they were a bit sus about Caspian given his relationship with Miraz, but after they test his character, they pledge his allegiance to him and they even armor him. Then they visit the 5 black dwarves, which are descendants of the dwarfs that supported Jadis in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and they are also related to Nickabrick. Now, they weren't convinced about Caspian, but they were like,
an enemy of our enemy is our friend.
and so that they would support Caspian just to get rid of Miraz. But they also wanted to call reinforcements of the descendants of Jadis's army, which were banished from Narnia, so priorities. But anyways, when the other Narnians came to the council in the dancing lawn, they pledged their allegiance to Caspian because their prophet, Glenstorm the Centaur, also saw Telvar and Amabel meet in the heavens. From here, the dwarves get busy with the weaponry and the rest work to fortify Aslan's house. When Miraz hears this news, he prepares an army to meet the Narnians, which Professor Cornelius finds out and he decides to run to warn Caspian and the other Narnians and stay with them. The Narnians fight against the Telmaranes in the first and the second battles of Baruna in the Narnian Revolution, also known as the War of Deliverance, but to no avail. And it is here where Prince Caspian makes a small council and asks them if he should blow Susan's horn to get the aid of the kings and queens of old. Now, again, the council was split on this, but ultimately they decide that they will blow the horn in secret so that the other Narnians don't lose hope if nothing happens, but that they would also send Trumpkin to Cair Paravel so that if the kings and queens of old do end up showing up, he can come and bring them back to Aslan's Howe. Unfortunately for Trumpkin, he gets caught by the Telmaranes. And finally, we catch up with the start of the movie. So basically, the stuff about the Telmaranes chasing Caspian into the woods, and then him blowing the horn, and Trumpkin getting caught, that's just the movie's way of hurrying things along so that we can focus more on the Pevensies. So, as the Pevensies are about to board the train to go to school, they get whipped to Narnia. Lucky ducks. Now, this is where the Pevensies go all Mystery Incorporated and try to figure out where they are and what has happened. And that's when they catch the Telmaranes trying to get rid of Trumpkin, and they go and save him. Now, unlike the movie, when Trumpkin is saved, he's not an annoying brat about it.
Drop him! That's the best you can come up with.
But the bit about him doubting them and the duel with Edmund, yeah, that all happens in the book. As the Pevensies are heading to Aslan's Howe, Peter decides that they're gonna go through a shortcut, which he remembers. Which is no longer a shortcut, and that really riles up the Pevensies. Now, this is where Lucy sees Aslan on the other side of the chasm and tells her siblings. But when they look, they don't see him. She tells them that she still can and that he wants them to follow. But with the exception of Edmund, the others don't believe her and decide to follow Trumpkin on another route to Aslan's Howe. Unfortunately for them, that route's blocked by Telmaranes. They camp for the night, and that's when Aslan comes to Lucy in a dream, telling her to go back to that place where she saw him. And so she wakes everyone up, and again, Edmund believes her, the others don't, but they decide to give it a go. Turns out that there is a hidden path in the rock face which will help them cross the River Rush. There, Lucy sees Aslan again, but the others still don't. Eventually, Edmund starts to see Aslan's shadow, and then Aslan himself, then followed by Peter seeing Aslan, and finally Susan. Aslan then introduces himself to Trumpkin by picking him up in his jaws and throwing him in the air and catching him in the paw.
Oh, that's not at all patronizing, is it?
Now this is where the group splits up. Lucy and Susan go with Aslan to get reinforcements, whereas Peter, Edmund, and Trumpkin go to meet Caspian. And just in the nick of time, because Knickerbrick over here has called his buddies Hate and Hunger and was forcing Caspian to give his blood to bring back the White Witch. Trumpkin, Peter, and Edmund come and they kill the hag, the dwarf, and the werewolf and are welcomed warmly by Caspian. Unlike
Prince Caspian? Yes? And who are you?
yeah, so the entire Peter v Caspian tension in the castle siege, they're just movie exclusives. After deliberation, Peter decides to beat Miraz in a duel of champions, while they wait for Aslan and the queens to return. Now, within the fragile politics of the Telmarine court, there were a few lords waiting for the opportunity to take Miraz's throne. Namely, the two brothers General Golzal and Lord Caspian and their cousin Lord Gregory. So when Edmund brings this challenge to Miraz, those three play the game just right so that Miraz is forced to take up the challenge to keep his pride. And to make sure that this duel is fair, both sides bring 3 marshals. The Narnians pick Glenstorm the Centaur, Wimbleweather the Giant, and the eldest of the Bugly Bears. whereas the Telmarines pick the three traitors, Glorzel, Sebastian, and Gregory. So that on its own is a hint of how this is gonna go. After a tough but fair duel, the brothers Glorzel and Sebastian turn around to the Telmarines, who are too far to see what's actually happening in the battle, and tell them that Peter had killed their king with an illegal move. And then, in the chaos, General Glorzel, or Sebastian in the movie, ends up killing Miraz. The movie went down the route of redeeming Glorzel as well as Pruna Prismia, probably to add some humanity to the Telmarine and break down that black and white, good guy, bad guy archetype which is in the books. Which I don't mind. But I think keeping 3 plotters would have been good for the movie. Anyways, this is where the second Battle of Baruna takes place, and I've got to give it to Disney. They made it really cool. When the Dryads take to the field, means the trees. Telmarines retreat, but they're trapped because Aslan destroyed the bridge to free the river god. And it's here on the shores which Caspian meets Aslan for the first time. And he's knighted by Peter and made the king of Narnia. And so the torch has been passed on, and it's time for the Pevensies to return to their life in England. For Susan and Peter, this would be their last time in Narnia. As a standalone, Prince Caspian tells the story of a young prince uniting a people and bringing peace. It tells a story of a boy born from evil but raised with a good heart, rectifying his ancestors' cruelties and making things right. It's a story about not letting your past define you, but your own strengths, your own weaknesses, and your own humility. Which on its own is a nice story to tell. However, this story isn't a standalone, but continues a story already started. For the Narnians, the events of Prince Caspian serve to tell a story about the impact of oppression on faith and the necessity of an external perspective to rebuild that faith within a community. Unlike last time, the Narnians didn't have Aslan as a proof for hope. But instead, they created hope themselves through pondering the consequences of assisting Caspian against his uncle. And for the Pevensies, it was a test of their sense of responsibility towards Narnia. So I guess my first question is, why? Why were the Pevensies taken out of Narnia just to be brought back again in circumstances which is worse off for them? It seems torturous for both the royals and the subjects, but I think that's the point. If you haven't noticed, the plot of the story aims to test the Narnians and the Pevensies. Caspian may be the main character for most of the story, but the Pevensies are the main characters for most of the franchise. Which is probably why the original name for this book was Return to Narnia Saving Prince Caspian. The focus is more on the 4 siblings, their life, and their development, not the events of Narnia. And this becomes more apparent in the final book, The Last Battle. Now, when I mean a test for the Pevensies, I don't mean that there is a right or a wrong answer, but as Aslan puts it,
your brother and sister have learned what they can from this world. Now it's time for them to live in their own.
This adds an additional dimension to Narnia. It's not a world equal to Earth for humans, but serves some kind of temporary purpose for the citizens of the real world. Interesting. Although we'll talk a little more in depth about this in other Narniaverse videos, this inequality may help us to explain why only humans can become kings and queens in Narnia. The qualities of the real world are necessary to become a ruler of Narnia. But I digress. In today's analysis, we'll be adding to our analysis of the 4 Pevensey siblings and look at the themes of hope and faith more generally in regards to the Narnians and Caspian. So let's begin. The first challenge the Pevensies face is this difference in time. For starters, their bodies since they were last in Narnia have gone back 15 years, which means that they may not be recognized. Then they learn that due to their disappearance in the Dark Ages which followed them, that Narnians have come to doubt their existence and that of Aslan, removing all the hope that they brought last time and the enthusiasm of Narnians to their current arrival. Unlike last time, where Aslan had prepared everything for them and given them the ability to succeed, they were starting from scratch this time. Where the events of the previous movie predominantly aimed to help the Narnians, with the Pevensies learning from that experience, this time it almost seems like it's the other way around. Yes, Narnia is in trouble, and yes, the Pevensies were brought to save the Narnians. But unlike the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Pevensies are not necessary for Narnia's success. Caspian's there. He is the Narnians' hope and drive to success. So the role of the Pevensies aimed to serve another purpose for Narnia, and the world that they had come into looks to challenge the Pevensies' understanding of themselves than ever before, particularly Peter and Susan. For the two eldest Pevensies, this second adventure was quite the blow to the ego, as well as their faith in Aslan. In the movie, this is especially apparent with Peter, who is struggling with this idea of being challenged and being seen as equal or sub-equal by others. Now, Peter in the books doesn't face this kind of challenge, as we see him telling Caspian that he's not here to replace him, but here to help put him on the throne. In the movie, it's more like,
You called us, remember? My first mistake.
No. Your first mistake was thinking you'd lead these people. Hey!
So now that we've started talking about Peter, let's get into a story arc. Again, I think the movies add a lot more emphasis and details on the personal development of each of the characters, so I'll be predominantly referencing it. This is by no means ingenuine to the source material, because in the end, the morals and lessons which are presented in the book also come across in the movie. And for me, as long as the purpose of the adaptation is in line with the purpose of the original source material, then it's fine by me. So we find Peter struggling to adjust to being normal again, treated without respect or dignity. Which is understandable. I mean, he was crowned king when he was about 14 or 16, depending on the adaptation, and he ruled for 15 years. That kind of power will definitely influence a teenager's self-perception and sense of worth. And Peter definitely believes that he was worth more than being pushed around by some bullies. However, this mindset isn't a good one. It has some arrogance to it. Initially, this self-perception was justified, necessary even, to give Peter the confidence to rule Narnia justly and keep the peace. Back in England, it means none all. He hasn't done anything there to earn that level of respect that he desires, and he's missing the most important point. His confidence was for his people, not himself. A king that doesn't understand the balance between assertiveness and humility, compassion and firmness cannot have true self-belief. Instead, they tip the scale between the lack of self-esteem and egotism. So Aslan brought Peter back to Narnia to teach him this lesson. Understanding your own capabilities, your limits, and believing in what you have without being affected internally for asking assistance when you reach your limitations. We see Peter initially desperately reclaiming the authority that he had in Narnia, basically by force. First, he leads his siblings and Trumpkin astray to prove that he knows Narnia and thus knows what to do with Narnia, but he's proven wrong, which is the first blow to his ego. Then he was wrong about not believing Lucy about Aslan, which wastes even more time and puts his leadership to question by a still skeptical Trumpkin. Blow 2. Then, when he meets Caspian, the Narnians are not initially on his side. That leads Peter to display another peacock show to assert his dominance. He launches a full-on movie-exclusive raid on Miraz's castle, contrary to the advice given to him, which goes horribly wrong. And this was the last straw for Peter. So he basically blows up in the face of Caspian, blaming him for his genetics, basically. The point is, we see Peter using others in his internal fight with himself, which in all honesty is never a good idea because it comes in the detriment of those relationships. In this case, quite literally. And we see Peter losing the battle to himself when he hesitates in front of the White Witch, actually considering the possibility of bringing her back for the sake of winning. Luckily, his brother was there for him. This situation was the light bulb moment for Peter, where he does become aware of his own actions and, more importantly, the impurity of his intentions. Just because morally you're standing on the right side, it doesn't mean that your actions are right. Like Peter, who's acting to reassert his dominance and authority in Narnia to relive those days that he dreamed of, made him act in a way which wasn't in the best interest of his subject who had put faith in him. Ultimately, they paid the price for it. As we see in Peter from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, one event that touches his heart is enough for Peter to transform for the better. In the first instance, it was his victory against Morgrim to save his sisters, and here the confrontation with Jadis. From here on out, Peter listens to Lucy, listens to Caspian, and puts his life alone on the line to rectify for his mistakes and pay the price for all the Narnians who had sacrificed their lives for his own internal struggle. Not only that, Peter acknowledges his youngest siblings as people who have authority over him and how much they had helped him on this particular journey. Peter is remorseful for his selfish acts and embarrassed by his own behavior. And now this ties into Peter's evolution with his relationship to Aslan. For the start of the movie, we see Peter is frustrated with Aslan.
It's been a year. How long does he expect us to wait?
And so finds himself being entitled to an audience with Aslan, perhaps an explanation? Generally, when we deem ourselves to be at a lower level than someone else, we listen to their instructions without question because we respect their opinion and their wisdom more than our own. So this question in itself proves the level of arrogance that Peter has. He believed that his opinion, his wisdom was on par with Aslan's, the creator of Narnia, and so needed answers for his current situation. When Lucy sees Aslan and he doesn't, he calls it to question. Because again, he believes himself better or equal to his sister and thus deserves to see Aslan just as she did. To which Lucy replies, "Maybe you weren't looking." This is both a literal and metaphorical statement, as Peter no longer saw Aslan at the same glory and status that Lucy saw and believed in. This lack of faith in Aslan, due to him having endured a year in England, and the state that Narnia was in when he returned, made Peter blind to him when he was right in front of him, which is more obvious in the book when they're literally following Aslan to Aslan's house and Peter can't see him until like the end. But ultimately, when the facade of his strength failed him, Peter turned to Aslan for help and repented for his actions by placing himself in a compromising position of life and death. This experience was the lesson Aslan was trying to teach Peter by bringing him back to Narnia, so that after he learns this lesson in Narnia, Peter can go back to the life that he was born into and apply it there. And so Aslan tells Peter that this will be his last time in Narnia, but Peter's okay with that. He feels right about this and understands Aslan's decision. Aslan says to Peter, "It's time for you to find me in your real world." And so Peter's self-development arc comes to an end. From lack of self-esteem and fear, to confidence and courage, to arrogance and ignorance, then humility and inner peace. Let's move on to Susan. Unlike the rest of the Pevensies that wished to return to Narnia, Susan had settled back to her London life. So returning back to Narnia was just a minor inconvenience for her. Susan is an adapter. In the first movie, we see her adapting to Narnia as she lived there for 15 years, and now she's adapted back to London. Now that is kudos to her logic and critical machine up here. And so we can see this reset in Susan's thinking. She's reverted back to believing in logical decisions only despite knowing that magic exists. And look, perhaps this wasn't just because of England, but also her royal duties in her past life. But essentially, upon realizing the state that Narnia is in now, it sapped all that beauty and gentleness that it had to her. So there was little in Susan's eye to justify not taking the rational survival stand in this situation. And so again, we see her disbelieving in Lucy's claim of seeing Aslan. Now, in the movie, we don't see this obvious objection, and we even see Susan consulting Lucy in private, but also invoking logic. However, in the book, Susan is the first to side with Trumpkin and vocally object to Lucy. She is also the final Pevensey to see Aslan, to which she breaks down crying, confessing that she didn't let her heart believe it was him, to which Aslan blows onto her and forgives her. In combination, these two versions are very telling about Susan's character. In the previous video, we mentioned that changes in Susan can only be caused by her positive perception of things. When that was removed from her and them returning to England, we don't know what effect it had on Susan. But the fact that Narnia was no longer that positive place when they came back made Susan disbelieve in Aslan's abilities. To Susan, there wasn't much positivity happening until she had a glimpse of hope again. Caspian. In the book, it was when the Narnians had gathered or were gathering at Aslan's house because of Caspian's calling to them that Susan eventually saw hope and then saw Aslan. And in the movie, the only person who could put a smile on Susan's face was Caspian. To her, he represented positivity in a world that had turned so savage. Now, there's no romantic subplot in the books because both the characters are 13 years old, but that doesn't change the fact that Caspian was a prime reason for Susan believing again. A flaw in her character identified in both the Narnian adventures so far is that she only believes when seeing. Now, being forgiven isn't enough to guarantee a steadfastness to hope, as we see in Susan's story in the future. Aslan wished for Susan to return to Narnia to show her to look for positivity in every situation that she's in and not to lose herself to her natural inclination to adapt to her surroundings. He wanted her to understand her inner voice and stand up for it regardless of what the world around her looked like. When we think that Susan had redeemed herself in going to find Aslan with Lucy, she is not afforded that luxury and stays behind, which foreshadows her future fate. And so her final outfit is adorned with daffodils, the only Pevensey to have her plant re-emerge in the second movie. And this indicates that Susan has not evolved from her experience and has stayed the same. Whether Susan had learnt her lesson or not, Aslan couldn't do more for her because only she could decide whether she wanted to learn that lesson or not. But there are no more lessons for her to learn in Narnia, and so this is also Susan's final time being here. Luckily for Lucy and Edmund, Narnia still has a few lessons to teach them, and so they're expected to return. This adventure highlights Lucy's strength as a leader and a believer, because regardless of the situation that she found Narnia in, she still believed in hope and wanted to make everything right again. She didn't care about her reputation being smudged because she knew that that reputation, it wasn't from her. It was from Aslan, and Aslan could make things right again. The lesson Aslan wished to teach Lucy was a lesson that every child eventually learned. Prioritizing the authorities in your life to how well they match your personal values. Just because Peter and Susan didn't believe her about seeing Aslan, it didn't mean Lucy should have ignored his calling for them and left him there waiting. Because of this situation of Lucy prioritizing her siblings' wrong actions over her own belief, which essentially is her silencing herself to please an authority for the sake of keeping peace, well, peace in ignorance is never true peace, as the Narnians themselves had experienced all these years by hiding. And so Lucy learned that the hard way by seeing the devastating consequences of her brother's decisions. As for Edmund, this story proves that what he went through last time has made him a truly good person. He believed in Lucy because
The last time I didn't believe Lucy, I ended up looking pretty stupid.
he saved his siblings rather than endanger them. He listened to what he was told. He accepted his status and the status of his older siblings, and he wasn't tempted by the White Witch. Edmund's story is a huge turnaround for him, and he was the only Pevensey who hadn't made a mistake throughout, to which Aslan greets him with a "well done" in the books. In the books, Edmund was the second to see Aslan after Lucy. First, he saw something moving ahead of Lucy, then he started seeing the shadow before finally seeing the caster. So, Edmund first believed, then he saw signs and reflections of the truth before observing it. And that's all I'm going to say about Lucy and Edmund today, given that we have an entire another movie to talk about them. But essentially, the Pevensies are amongst the Narnians who were being saved by Caspian. His blow of the horn allowed them to look at themselves again and figure out what parts of them they had lost in the real world and what they needed to fix about themselves. Where the Pevensies help is their act as proof of Caspian's claim of bringing a new Narnia. They are the gift Caspian brings to the Narnians to cement their loyalty to him, as well as helping Caspian prove himself as worthy to the Narnian throne to Aslan.
I do not think I am ready.
And asking for help is the embodiment of those words.
It's for that very reason I know you are.
Yes, Caspian was doing an excellent job without them, and the Narnians had pledged their allegiance to him. But even if Caspian won, peace wouldn't have lasted, because the decision of putting him on the throne was democratic, not divine. So it can be questioned at any time by any Narnian. And this possibility would only have put Narnia back into the position that they were in when the previous kings and queens were missing. This is all because the Narnians have lost faith in Aslan. Just as the Narnians needed Aslan to come and prepare them for the Pevensies' rule, they need his intervention again to accept Caspian as a nation. It doesn't just work with a few people believing it and the others going along with it for their own personal benefit. But how can Aslan come to the Narnians when they don't believe in him anymore? I mean, they can easily say that he's just another lion in the woods. I mean, it has been 1,303 years since Narnians had seen him in Narnia, so no one actually knows who he is. Aslan needs to bring someone that the Narnians would believe and would recognize him. I wonder who that could be. So that's why the Pevensies were whipped back into Narnia. Proof of the old magic through the horn and living witnesses to Aslan himself. From being hope, they have transitioned to being bringers of hope and passing that torch to Caspian, which is represented through the change in wardrobe from more medieval inspired clothing to Tudor or Renaissance inspired clothing. As for Caspian, there isn't too much that we can add onto him that we haven't already mentioned other than his people's history. But even still, I don't think that this history adds much to him as a character, because I don't believe that the current generation should be accountable for the sins of their predecessors. However, for those that believe otherwise, this could be a lesson drawn from this novel. Caspian's great ancestors were from Earth, and they sailed from their homeland to an island of natives where they slaughtered all the natives and inhabited it. It just happened that on the same island there was a portal to Narnia, which some of these inhabitants crossed over and so became the Telmaranes. When Caspian learnt this from Aslan, he felt remorseful for what his people had done in the past in both worlds and pledges to make amends and rule justly. Look, if guilt is a motivator for you to be a good person, then go for it. I just don't believe that a person should feel guilty for things that they hadn't directly or indirectly caused. But in some senses, this plotline actually holds a lot of weight for a person like me who only believes in personal accountability, because it creates the strong contrast between Caspian and Peter's characters. A person like Caspian who lowers his opinion of himself because he bears the burden of his ancestors' sins, and a person like Peter who is too arrogant to see his own mistakes because he believes that he belongs to the right side. In short, this story is a lesson about having faith in hardship, whether it be the Narnians under the Telmarine occupation or the Pevensies in their new life in England. Without faith, fear, arrogance, doubt, and skepticism corrupts our intentions and actions, which ultimately do more harm to others than good. Because selfishness looks out for nobody except itself. One needs to know how to order the hierarchy of authority in their life to make sure that they continue to walk a path which aligns with their own personal values and beliefs. A much deeper and much darker tale than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And for the movie, it definitely caters for a more older audience. I would recommend that the youngest audience for this movie are like mature 9-year-olds, as there is quite a bit in it. This movie isn't just victory after victory. There is a lot of tragic loss and brutality in it. Families get divided, loved ones are lost, and there's betrayal as well. It's less ideal than the first entry, and it exposes a lot of the more harsh realities of the world, which I think is okay because it's a heavy theme in this movie, which makes it an excellent watch for a more mature and self-developing audience. That was the second Narnia movie and fourth book in the series. If you want to watch this yourself, please use a streaming platform that doesn't support the violation of human rights or the spread of negativity in the world. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with other Narnia enthusiasts. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on next week's drop. Be brave, be happy, and be kind, and we'll catch you all next time.